Yesterday, Mark Carney stood in front of an international press corps in The Hague and delivered the most consequential defence commitment in a Canadian generation. It wasn't a trial balloon, and it wasn't a vague diplomatic talking point designed to satisfy a temporary news cycle. It was a binding, signed pledge committing Canada to spend a staggering 5% of its gross domestic product on national defence. If you are just discovering money signals, hit subscribe right now before we go any deeper into the hidden architecture of this deal. What the mainstream media is treating as a routine NATO photo op is actually a massive structural rupture. Let's ground this in cold, hard numbers. A 5% GDP target means Ottawa has committed to an annual defence budget of roughly 150 billion Canadian dollars. To understand the sheer scale of that shift, consider that Canada spent just $41 billion on defence in 2024. Carney hasn't just tweaked the budget. He has signed an agreement that nearly quadruples Canada's military spending. This is a complete top-to-bottom restructuring of the Canadian state's financial priorities, and the ripple effects will reshape our domestic economy for the next quarter century. The official narrative says Canada made this leap because the global security environment deteriorated overnight. That is the convenient public fiction. The other half of the story, the strategic reality most coverage has missed, is that Ottawa finally ran out of road after a decade of intense, asymmetric political warfare from Washington. Donald Trump didn't invent the complaint that Canada was a military freeloader, but he weaponized it with devastating efficiency. By 2014, successive Canadian governments had let defence spending erode to a pathetic 1% of GDP, exactly half of the baseline NATO obligation agreed to at the Wales summit. For years, Ottawa treated American protection as a permanent, cost-free utility. But when Washington explicitly tied its mutual defence commitments to dollar figures, the calculation changed. The longest undefended border in the world suddenly looked like Canada's greatest strategic vulnerability. When the White House hinted that American protection of the Arctic archipelago was negotiable, the illusion of automatic security shattered. This $150 billion pledge is not an act of sudden military ambition. It is an expensive insurance policy paid under extreme duress to preserve Canadian economic access to the North American continent. Subscribe to Money Signals for clear, fact-driven analysis on how these geopolitical pressures dictate domestic policy. To see how this trap closed on Ottawa, we have to look at the precise sequencing of events. Here is the timeline to keep things clear. The groundwork was laid over a decade of escalating rhetoric, but the actual execution occurred with remarkable speed. In June 2025, 32 NATO members gathered in The Hague under intense pressure to match Washington's demands. Spain attempted to hold the line, refusing to sign on to the 5% target, and arguing that capability goals could be met at 2.1%. European diplomats managed to soften the final communiqué's language, changing all allies to a looser collective allies to let Madrid slip out the back door. Canada, highly exposed and deeply dependent on US intelligence sharing, enjoyed no such luxury. Carney signed the full agreement on camera. By November 2025, Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne tabled the first fiscal framework under this new reality, locking in $81 billion in new defence allocations over the first 5 years. Then, in February 2026, the structural cracks began to show publicly when the Parliamentary Budget Officer issued a severe, unvarnished warning about the fiscal math behind this strategy. Finally, in June 2026, the Pentagon demanded a detailed year-by-year procurement roadmap, proving that rhetorical compliance would no longer satisfy Washington. What this sequence reveals is an engineered political operation designed to lock Canada into a long-term financial trajectory. Regardless of which political party wins the next federal election, the government is attempting to manage the public shock by splitting the 5% target into two distinct categories. The official line is that 3.5% will go directly to core military hardware, jets, ships, and personnel, while the remaining 1.5% will fund broader security infrastructure like dual-use ports, northern airports, and telecommunications networks. Carney's strategic calculation is that the infrastructure component can be absorbed through existing regional development funds. But independent economists see right through this accounting trick. Randall Bartlett, the director of Canadian economics at Desjardins, noted that hitting even the core 3.5% target requires compounding budget increases of 7% to 10% every single year for a decade. This is not a one-time spending surge, it is an unsustainable growth curve. Because the federal treasury cannot generate $150 billion out of thin air, much of this expansion will inevitably be debt-financed. The Parliamentary Budget Office confirmed this grim reality, projecting that the defence surge will add an extra $63 billion to the federal deficit by 2035 alone. Total annual military spending will hit $160 billion by the middle of the next decade, completely eclipsing historical peacetime norms. The immediate domestic consequence is a direct, painful trade-off between national security and the Canadian social safety net. We are already seeing the first wave of these adjustments buried inside departmental reports. While the defence budget jumps by $5.3 billion this fiscal year alone, funding for health, environmental science and regional development is being quietly scaled back. Employment and Social Development Canada is clawing back $1.4 billion, terminating summer jobs programs and pausing childcare expansions. Global Affairs Canada is cutting its workforce by 7%, axing 887 personnel, while international climate finance commitments are being allowed to sunset entirely. This is the real price of the Hague Agreement. Wealth is being redirected away from domestic services and poured directly into the industrial defence complex. Make sure you are subscribed and hit that like button if you want to trace exactly where these billions are landing. The bitter irony of this historic reallocation of capital is that spending money does not automatically equal building military capability. Canada's procurement system is notoriously broken, characterised by decades of bureaucratic delays, shifting requirements and political interference. Consider the state of the hardware today. The Royal Canadian Navy's current submarine fleet consists of 4 second-hand vessels purchased from Britain in the late 1990s. The youngest hull is already over 30 years old. While the Canadian Patrol Submarine Project aims to purchase up to 12 new conventional submarines, the project remains trapped in the early bidding stages between German and South Korean builders. No contracts are signed, no funding is fully secured, and no delivery timeline exists. The same structural inertia plagues the River-class destroyer program. Although full production nominally began in April 2025, the first operational surface combatant isn't scheduled to enter service until the early 2030s. NATO has explicitly assigned Canada the vital strategic task of anti-submarine warfare in the North Atlantic and Arctic, yet the specialised ships required to perform that mission remain lines on a blueprint. Even the high-profile F-35 fighter jet contract is moving at a crawl. Final assembly on Canada's very first airframe only commenced in February 2026. Independent defence analysts have pointed out that Canada's current method for calculation relies on creative accounting under loose NATO rules. Ottawa routinely folds the Canadian Coast Guard, Veterans Affairs benefits and RCMP pension allocations into its total defence figures to inflate the final percentage on paper. But as conservative critics have correctly argued, a larger number on a government spreadsheet does not put a single usable hull in the water or a single fighter jet in the sky. This entire strategic pivot is happening over the heads of the Canadian electorate. During the 2025 federal election, the ruling party's platform promised a modest, gradual climb to meet the old 2% NATO benchmark by 2030. Within months of taking power, that electoral mandate was discarded in favour of a 5% target by 2035, executed under intense foreign pressure without a single minute of formal parliamentary debate. Yet, public opinion data reveals a profound, anxious shift within the Canadian psyche. A comprehensive Nanos research poll conducted late last year showed that a distinct majority of Canadians now support increased military spending, even when explicitly told it will require cutting domestic social programs. Only 17% of the population actively opposes the expansion. This support is not driven by a sudden wave of martial enthusiasm. It is driven by deep, systemic distrust of the United States. A striking 56% of Canadian respondents now view American global influence as explicitly negative, a disapproval rating that outpaces public sentiment in Germany or France. When a US administration muses publicly about annexing Greenland or jokes about Canada becoming the 51st state, it shatters the foundational assumption of Canadian grand strategy, that our southern neighbour is a benign protector. The Canadian public is consenting to these massive budget cuts not because they want to project power abroad, but because they realise the nation's survival depends on ending its absolute strategic reliance on an unpredictable superpower. The government is attempting to reframe this fiscal crisis as an industrial opportunity, projecting that the spending surge will eventually support 125,000 high-skilled manufacturing jobs across the country. Shipyards in Atlantic Canada and aerospace clusters in Quebec are already positioning themselves to capture these massive federal outlays. Carney himself has used unvarnished language to describe this moment, calling it a historic rupture rather than a standard economic transition. He has argued explicitly that when economic and military integration with a larger partner becomes total, it ceases to be a partnership and becomes subordination instead. This massive defence spending hike is the first desperate attempt by Ottawa to purchase a margin of sovereign manoeuvrability. The state is betting that by tripling its total defence commitment to a cumulative $900 billion over the next 10 years, it can diversify its supply chains, build an independent Arctic surveillance network, and reduce its vulnerability to Washington's economic blackmail. But the underlying fiscal math remains unyielding. A state cannot build sovereign independence on a foundation of ballooning deficits and hollowed-out domestic institutions. The cash is already moving, the cuts to public services have begun, and the Pentagon is still openly mocking Canada's lack of a detailed plan. Carney has locked the country into a high-stakes trillion-dollar gamble with absolutely no margin for error. But the most consequential question remains unanswered. Ultimately, Canada's historic $150 billion defence pledge represents a desperate, debt-fueled insurance policy extracted under intense pressure from Washington. It is an immense fiscal sacrifice that reallocates vast domestic resources to purchase a narrow margin of sovereign survival in a fracturing global order. OttawaCitizen.com, zooming out to the broader strategic chessboard, this shift signals a profound transformation in Canada-US relations. For 3 generations, Ottawa operated under a comfortable Continental division of labour. Washington provided the overarching security umbrella, while Canada focused its capital on building a robust domestic welfare state and projecting soft power abroad. That pre-Trump era of automatic, unconditional American protection is officially dead. By demanding a hard 5% of GDP for defence, the White House has effectively commodified the bilateral security relationship. Integration is no longer an organic partnership, it is an economic prerequisite. If Ottawa wants to keep the border open for 94% of our automotive production and maintain access to the broader integrated North American marketplace, it must now pay a steep continental security tax beyond the immediate bilateral dynamic. This massive rearmament program will fundamentally alter the structure of Canada's primary economic sectors, creating clear winners and losers. The immediate beneficiary is the domestic defence and aerospace corridor, stretching through Ontario and Quebec. Under the newly minted Defence Industrial Strategy, Ottawa is aiming to direct 70% of this historic spending to Canadian firms, attempting to turn a fiscal burden into a high-tech manufacturing engine. www.policymagazine.ca. But this heavy concentration of state capital into military hardware will actively crowd out investments in other vital non-defence industries. Simultaneously, the definition of security itself is expanding to swallow the energy and infrastructure sectors. By allocating 1.5% of GDP to defence-related infrastructure, the government is repositioning northern transport hubs, telecommunications grids, and critical mineral extraction sites as explicitly military assets. Our ports and pipelines are no longer just commercial conduits. They are now frontline assets in a continental fortification strategy. BudgetCarter.ca, this new reality stands in sharp, painful contrast to the grand strategy of the late 20th century. In that bygone era, Canadian governments could casually slash defence spending to 1% of GDP to balance federal books, confident that geography and the Monroe Doctrine would shield the nation from foreign aggression. Global alliances were viewed through the lens of multilateral diplomacy and peacekeeping, rather than raw industrial-scale deterrence. Today, that strategic complacency has been obliterated. The international system has transitioned from a rules-based framework to an era of unvarnished transaction, where security is bought, sold, and strictly audited by the dominant superpower. Canada is being forced to learn the brutal grammar of hard power, rebuilding a hollowed-out military machine at an exorbitant cost simply to retain its seat at the table. The true test of this economic and military transformation is approaching far faster than the government's 10-year timeline suggests. The next critical juncture will arrive in 2029, during NATO's scheduled mid-term compliance review. By that year, the compounding fiscal strain of 7% to 10% annual budget increases will be fully colliding with a ballooning federal deficit and an increasingly strained Canadian taxpayer. www.cvnews.ca The political consensus that currently sustains this pledge will face an unyielding wall of fiscal reality. Future leaders will be forced to choose between executing crippling cuts to core domestic infrastructure or defaulting on an international security pledge in front of an increasingly transactional White House. The bill for Canadian sovereignty has officially arrived, and how Ottawa navigates that 2029 deadline will determine whether this nation remains an independent actor on the global stage or is permanently reduced to a subordinate border security zone. If this deep dive into the hidden forces shaping our SOVA helped you see the full chessboard, make sure you're subscribed to Money Signals and hit that like button. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Can Canada realistically deliver on this $150 billion promise without breaking its economy?